I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, ongoing concerns raised by Barack Obama's decision to permit the UN Security Council to pass an anti-Israel resolution labeling every Jewish community on the West Bank, including the Old City of Jerusalem, to be in flagrant violation of international law. And we've been speaking with Jewish leaders to get their reactions to this Obama decision and to hear why they believe the president would take such a dramatic step at this time. And on our GBS phones now, we have one of American Jewry's foremost leaders, Rabbi Rick Jacobs, president of the Union for Reform Judaism, which is the organization of Reform synagogues throughout America, and which may well be the largest Jewish organization on the American scene today. And Rick Jacobs, thanks so much for joining us on JBS once again.
It's my pleasure, Mark.
Rick, when you heard the United States had decided to abstain on the UN Security Council resolution and not exercise its veto, what was your original initial reaction?
Well, first of all, we saw the approach of the decision, and I was very busy the 2 days before the UN vote, trying to raise our collective voice with the U.S. administration, the White House, and our ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power. So when the actual abstention came, I was saddened. I was deeply disappointed, and still believe that it was a very, very misguided decision by the U.S. administration.
Okay. Look, Rick, we understand you have in general been very supportive of the Obama administration. You've been critical of Israel's dragging its feet on the peace process. In that context, one might have expected Rick Jacobs and the URJ to endorse this presidential decision, and yet you say you were disappointed. Explain to us what seems to be a contradiction and why there's no contradiction for you at all.
Well, first of all, we, as you know, have been strongly opposed to the settlement enterprise in Israel. Believe it is deeply problematic for the two-state solution, which has been the foremost policy of the U.S. government for Republican and Democratic administrations for the last quarter century, and is still the stated policy of the current Israeli government. So given that we have a longstanding opposition to the settlements, and frankly, in addition, that we are very, very concerned about what we hear from the nascent Trump administration about their Israel policy, particularly their policy regarding settlements. And in spite of all those, it is absolutely clear to us that the United Nations is not the venue to resolve this very, very complex issue. The UN has such a lack of moral credibility in resolving such a complicated issue that we felt it was very, very important for the U.S. government to veto this UN resolution. And I don't think it's actually out of keeping. We, by the way, are not in lockstep with an administration here or an administration in Israel. We lead according to our core values and according to our resolutions as a movement. And even with our questions about what this might mean for the the settlements going forward, not now, not at this late moment in the Obama administration, and particularly not at the United Nations.
That was beautifully said. Incidentally, I want it said in public. You have been very courageous in some very difficult, sensitive situations and when you're facing issues, and no one has ever questioned your integrity or your sincerity or your Jewish commitment. And every now and then you'll hear people criticizing you and the URJ for positions you take. But one should be very clear that anybody who disagrees with you is really disagreeing with you on policy, not on Jewish commitment. And you again have taken a very courageous stand, because people would have said, in a kind of knee-jerk way, well, we know where Rick Jacobs is going to be, we know where the URJ is going to be. I want to understand, because you are closer than most, Rick, what do you think it was? Why didn't the administration, why didn't the president understand this was not the right forum. What were you unable to convince the administration of that you wish they understood, and why didn't they understand it?
Well, I can't explain, Mark, why they didn't. I think the calculation is not so hard. It is a complex issue, but I think what was important to think through is what was the possible gain for the abstention? What actually would be advanced, and what would be harmed? I think what was harmed is, frankly, any future Democratic candidates to the Congress or to the White House will have a exceptionally difficult time in conveying their deep pro-Israel commitments. So I don't think this was ever going to advance the peace process. I think from the administration's point of view, they believed that this would put down a marker and bring the international community. They believed that the resolution was even-handed. I think, on a cursory review of the resolution, it couldn't be concluded that it was even-handed. To say that all 67 borders, are equal. Well, in Jerusalem, we know the 67 border. It's the difference between East and West Jerusalem. And to say that standing at the Western Wall, for example, is across the 67 line, and therefore everything that goes on in the Jewish quarter is a legal settlement, I think is a very, very wrong approach, and it confuses people who I think have a general understanding of where the settlements are largely in the West Bank. So I think that the administration thought that they had no choice. I think they believed that this was even-handed, even though I think many had pointed out that the resolution was not at all even-handed. And I think they made a miscalculation of what would be gained, and frankly, what we're all facing right now is what was lost, and how this may very much set back the peace process, especially with the new administration moving in a matter of a couple of weeks. And potentially, this decision may have strengthened the very conservative forces in Israel that have been looking for annexation. The most recent decision in terms of the Amienu settlement and the illegal outpost, this may have given, unfortunately, a boost to those efforts. So I think on reflection, it was simply a very, very serious miscalculation, and it's quite troubling, and it's sad to us because there was enormous goodwill. The U.S. administration over the last 8 years has done more in terms of security. The MOU that was concluded, $38 billion for Israel arms, was unprecedented, and I just hope that this is not the only thing that people will remember of the Obama administration's relationship to the State of Israel. But it's very problematic because it's potentially the last big decision, and it leaves those of us who, I think see ourselves as progressive Zionists, feeling that that this was really misguided and quite off base.
Boy, again, you say it beautifully, and I'm so glad people have a chance to hear you articulate these ideas. The resolution defines the West Bank as Palestinian territory. And there are many, you and I know, there are many American Jews who have said that, called the West Bank Palestinian territory. And those of us who have been lobbying for a two-state solution hope that one day the Palestinians and the Israelis will reach a point where it can be Palestinian territory. But at the moment, Rick, if somebody said to you, Rick Jacobs, is the West Bank Palestinian territory, how would you answer?
Well, I think we still see the West Bank as now having divided authority, the different areas going back to the Oslo Accords. I think that what we see is that the West Bank is going to be, I hope one day, it won't be one day in a matter of months, but one day it will be the core of the Palestinian state. There's really not another place for it. But to say that there isn't a long-standing understanding that some of the settlement blocks could very well and should very well be contained within the State of Israel. But that's part of final status negotiations. What we're all very, very nervous about is that, the whole mindset of some of those who are coming into the new administration, that frankly you can annex the West Bank, make it part of Israel, absorb the Palestinian citizens of the West Bank, and some would say, including David Friedman, the appointed ambassador to Israel under the Trump administration, that would not threaten the democratic Jewish core of the State of Israel. But demographics point otherwise. And, to say that this has all been resolved is wrong. But even your very careful wording, Mark, that this is the West Bank, not Judea and Samaria. As soon as you say that territory is Judea and Samaria, what you're making a claim to is that this is part of the biblical land of Israel, and therefore it is ours. And by the way, I wouldn't dispute that, going back to the Bible, we have a right to the greater land of Israel. However, I think over the past decades, what has been clear is that plenty of Jewish leaders and Israeli leaders understood that for the sake of coexistence, for the sake of preserving the Jewish democratic state of Israel, we can't only think about biblical definitions. We have to think about ways that we can share a very contested part of this earth, and we want nothing more than there should be security for the state of Israel. No one who wants a two-state solution wants to rush from where we are immediately. There's no chance of that. And the Palestinians do own a very serious share of the responsibility for the impasse that we are currently in, and for their incitement and their unwillingness to move forward on some of these key issues. But what is also clear is that for Palestinians, as they watch settlement after settlement, illegal outpost after illegal outpost, green-lighted by the current government, I think they understand that the chances of building that two-state solution become more remote as we move forward. So even as we oppose this decision at the UN, I deeply believe, and hundreds of Israeli generals would agree, that frankly the whole settlement enterprise threatens the very heart of why we have a Jewish democratic state. And to think that because this ill-conceived resolution passed the Security Council, that now the state of Israel can do whatever it would like with that disputed territory would be a gross misreading of not just the present moment, but for the chances of building that two states for two peoples, which isn't, just an idealistic dream. When Ariel Sharon made his decision that we had to actually have some notion of a two states for two peoples, because it was otherwise going to threaten the democratic core of Israel. You couldn't have that many Palestinian citizens in a Jewish state and give them full rights as they would deserve and still preserve the Jewish majority. So I think this is not about idealism. It's not about naivete. It's about a solution that is far from ready to be enacted. But anything that we do that builds further obstacles for that two-state solution are things that we must, in good conscience, oppose.
Rick Jacobs, you are doing fabulous work for the URJ, and I know you are always on the run. I know you're talking to me on JBS right now while you're literally on the run. I appreciate you and the time you give us, and I wish you kol tuv v'hatzlacha and Chag Sameach for the rest of Hanukkah, a Happy New Year, and I hope you and I get a chance to speak often. Thank you, my friend.
I would look forward to that. And Chag Sameach to you, Mark, and to all your listeners.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate this opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you. On our JBS phones now, we have another articulate and thoughtful Jewish leader, and one who has passionate feelings about the state of Israel. Ken Bob, president of the Progressive Zionist organization, Amienu, which means our people. Ken, good to have you with us again.
Thank you for having me.
So, Ken, when you heard first that the president had decided to permit this resolution to pass, what was your reaction?
My immediate reaction was really to understand why the United States may have taken this position. And my working assumption was it was actually in reaction to events in Israel, the Israeli government's continued settlement policies. And I think at this point in his administration, in the waning days, it felt like the administration wanted to send a message that they were still opposed to the settlement expansion.
Do you feel that justified the U.S. decision?
I think it does. I think it's a close call, to be honest. And looking at this resolution very carefully, and I read some commentary that you could even tell that it had some Western input. It wasn't one of the typical resolutions. It stressed a two-state solution. It included opposition to incitement to violence, and then obviously had some very strong language about settlement. So I think it's fair to say that this resolution really was an anti-settlement resolution, not an anti-Israel resolution. And I think it went to a bar that the United States could live with.
Okay, let me tell you what bothers me about it, and then I want to hear your perspective. And Sloan, I want to bring up the first article of the resolution on the screen, and then I'm going to read it so that Ken can hear it, our viewers can hear it and see it. But this is the first article, that the resolution reaffirms that the establishment by Israel of settlements in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including East Jerusalem, has no legal validity and constitutes a flagrant violation under international law and is a major obstacle to the achievement, of the two-state solution and a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace. So, Ken, is the West Bank Palestinian territory?
It is. I mean, it's now, that's really where we've come to. And again, there's been a whole historical, train from 1967 to where Jordan has absolved themselves of the West Bank and said this is up for the Palestinians to deal with. Israel has recognized a Palestinian entity there and rights. There's obviously a variety of different feelings about it, but the Prime Minister himself has said he believes a Palestinian state should rise there. So it really is Palestinian territory at this point. Now, I agree that it's disputed. I'm not going into here and saying that there aren't rights here and there isn't even a biblical connection to the land. So I'm not going to say there isn't. I simply think now that the time has come for the Israeli government to really get down to brass tacks here. I think the growing number of settlers is not going to make it easier, and that's been my case all along. There's now 90,000 settlers beyond the security barrier. And by all accounts, when people talk about this, we're not talking about the settlement blocks, despite what this resolution says. We're talking about those beyond the security barrier. And I think Israel has to deal with this more seriously.
Again, from my perspective, to me, the issue here, the issue of this resolution and why so many in the Jewish community are very disappointed that the president chose this path, and including Rick Jacobs, who has been as adamant in favor of the two-state solution, against settlements, feels that the administration has, the Netanyahu government has dragged its feet and holds the Netanyahu government to blame for a lot of what's happened. He also says that it was a mistake for President Obama to ever permit a resolution like this to be passed in the Security Council. And I want to make a distinction here between being against the settlements, which I feel it is a perfectly legitimate position to take. I don't find it as clear-cut as you do what the I keep calling it Obama and Netanyahu, what the Netanyahu government has or has not permitted. I have people coming on JBS all the time, Ken, who say that the Netanyahu administration has not been supportive of settlements outside the settlement blocks. But be that as it may, what's upsetting here is that while the West Bank is, for many people, the incipient Palestinian state, it is the Palestinian state in waiting, until there is an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians that establishes a Palestinian state, there is no Palestinian sovereignty or right to that land. It never was historically. There was no juridical decision that ever gave the West Bank to the Palestinians. And so that while, again, we all understand in a Palestinian state this will become Palestinian territory, for the United Nations to say now, and for the United States to pile on in this statement, that the West Bank is Palestinian territory, to me, Ken, that is enormously problematic, and I believe worse. It is part of a big lie perpetrated by those who ultimately believe not only the West Bank is Palestinian territory, but all the land from the river to the sea is Palestinian territory. So I want you to explain to our viewers what has ever given the status of the West Bank Palestinian territory. What event or what juridical decision has ever made the West Bank Palestinian territory?
The Oslo Accords signed by the Israeli government, by the elected Israeli government in the 90s, actually designated this as Palestinian territory. And I think that's an Israeli government decision. So far be it for the rest of the world not to accept that. So that's when it really became a international, I think, initiative to help Israel and the Palestinians reach this peace agreement. And I must say, I just think this resolution actually does the opposite of what you're describing in terms of people saying, well, then the whole territory is the Palestinians. This resolution very clearly states the Israel has a right to exist, and there should be a two-state solution. So BDS supporters actually are not applauding this resolution. I follow all of these people, and they actually also understand that Israel comes out very strong in this resolution if you believe in a two-state solution and you're frustrated with the Israeli government's non-participation sort of in this process. Now, for instance, I would be the first to say that right now we're not about to see a two-state solution. So the call here in the resolution is to preserve the option of a two-state solution. And the continuing settlement expansion doesn't do that. So I think to answer your specific question, it's the Oslo Accords that the Israeli government signed, whose direction was to establish a Palestinian state on the territory we're talking about. So I think it's pretty clear.
What do you answer those who say that if the president wanted to bring pressure on Israel and the Netanyahu government, there were ways to do it outside what is, Ken, an unprecedented step of not using an American veto to stop a Security Council resolution that is clearly aimed at slamming Israel? Could the Obama administration have chosen some other method?
Right. I think that's a really great question. I think because it goes to the heart of why the Obama administration may have chosen at this time to abstain. I think they were running out of tools. You know, one of the tools that people talk about a lot is using the financial aid package. You hear that a lot from people who are very critical of Israel and the occupation. And as you can tell, the Obama administration hasn't just not used the military aid package as a punishment tool, but instead just signed a 10-year extended increased package. So I would, the same people who ask that question, I would say, what do you have in mind? I think that the Obama administration felt they had nothing left in the toolkit that the U.S. government could do. And so this was something that obviously it may not be useful, but they certainly succeeded in getting everyone's attention. So I don't know what other tools they had left.
I am just a touch surprised that it doesn't bother you at all that what the administration chose to do was, for the first time in American history, not support the State of Israel in the Security Council in a United Nations which you and I both, we've talked about this many times. The one thing there's no disagreement about is that the United Nations is currently an anti-Israel body, and that's not where you want you don't want the international community to be able to use a Security Council resolution to criminalize the State of Israel and to to put Israeli officials in jeopardy if they travel to certain countries, which are going to say, you represent a country that is in flagrant violation of international law. We're bringing you before the International Criminal Court. It's not what we would normally want, Ken.
I agree with you. And first of all, I think it's a little bit an exaggeration to say this is historic in the first time. I'm sure you've seen some of the other reports on things that were done during Reagan's White House in the UN in not vetoing resolutions on settlements. It's not the first time. It's not the first time. It's the first time in many years. And I think it wasn't a coincidence that Ambassador Power invoked Ronald Reagan and his views on the settlement when she opened her comments, because this has actually been consistent U.S. policy, and the Security Council in the past actually has been used in this way, but it's been many years, I agree. And I do, by the way, agree that the UN has been very unfair towards Israel, and this was indeed a very big departure. This is the first time in his 8 years as president that they didn't use the veto, and I think he did it, to make a point. So, as I said at the very beginning when you asked me, I think it was a close call. So I'm not suggesting that I have no concerns and no worries about how this might play out. However, as we know, there's very little teeth to this resolution. I know you've mentioned, chasing Israeli officials. Countries have already done that. One of the countries that has been rumored to have been behind this resolution is actually Great Britain, and that's a country where actually some Israeli politicians visiting have been arrested and then later released. So this resolution isn't going to start that type of process. It's going out there, and I think the Israeli government, the things the Israeli government could have done to avoid this abstention, which they didn't do, and I think the Israeli government has to look forward about and be concerned about isolation in the world. I'm not happy to say this. I'm not celebrating. I'm mourning that we got to
I understand. Is the Western Wall, and are those Jews living in the Old City in flagrant violation of international law?
Look, I think that the Jerusalem section of this resolution was very worrisome. So no, I'm not supportive of that language, and I think that all thoughtful people understand that when they're talking about this, they're not talking about the Jewish quarter or the Kotel, the Western Wall. I certainly don't.
Well, Ken, it is always wonderful to hear your take on any issue confronting Jewish life today. We don't always agree, but I'm always thrilled to share ideas with you, and I appreciate the way you let me push you, and it's always a joy having you. So we will continue our discussion in the very near future. Thank you very, very much.
Well, I always thank you for the opportunity, and Chag Sameach to you and all the viewers.
Thank you, Ken. The thoughts of Ken Bob, president of Amienu. As always, my thanks to our director, Sloan Copeland, production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, JBS's associate director, Dara Golub, editors Dennis Golan and John McDevitt, and to the producers of In the News, Carol Lilienthal and Ruth Golub. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.